Welcome back to our Journalists Roundtable. Let's get right back to it. And Simon, another big story that's been grabbing the headlines, the murders in Bangladesh of bloggers, self-proclaimed atheists, professors, academics. We've been seeing that at least 20 people murdered in Bangladesh, many of them from the LGBT community as well. That violence is escalating. Any indication on who is responsible for this?
Well, it depends, of course, on whom you ask. I mean, if you ask the Bangladeshi government, they're blaming the country's opposition and saying that this is internal politics. However, you clearly have Islamic extremist groups, those affiliated with Islamic State, proxies of Islamic State, claiming responsibility for not just the attacks that took place this week, but the murders of at least 5 people that took place over the course of the last year under very similar and chilling circumstances. You know, this is clearly demonstrating the limits of civil society's development inside Bangladesh. It is clearly demonstrating also the transnational and global spread of the threat of Islamic extremism, and it's putting the government of Bangladesh really in a very, very difficult position where world powers, including the United States and others, are saying you've got to speak out forcefully about what's taking place here. And the government is saying, well, actually, hang on a second, the people who got killed this week, for example, were engaged in the dissemination of pornography online. They were LGBT bloggers. So you're clearly seeing all sorts of societal limits and barriers clashing in Bangladesh. And it's got to be very concerning, particularly to the country's regional neighbors, but also to international observers.
Guan, you've been following the story as well. How has the Bangladeshi government responded to what's going on?
What I think is Beijing can work more closely with Bangladesh, because after all, Bangladesh is one of the few neighbors in the south that can be called a real partner, in that Bangladesh purchases tanks, frigates, and military aircraft from China. They have a close relationship, not just economically, but strategically, and in terms of security. So China has a stake in that. It has its own northwestern region that is predominantly Muslim. There are numerous terrorist attacks in China, what was called terrorist attacks by the central government. So there can be more information sharing between China and Bangladesh. But also Beijing is walking a thin line in terms of the LGBT community, because those communities in China are sort of living in the shadow. So Beijing so far has a muted response to the Bangladesh attacks, in that it condemns this attack in and of itself. But when it comes to LGBT community, Beijing is very careful in calling them out.
Right, Afshin, here we have a country, Bangladesh, which has a secular tradition. Is there danger it could go the way of, say, Pakistan, where we have these myriad radical groups that are operating? I mean, to what extent have groups like, you know, Simon mentioned it a moment ago, Al-Qaeda or the Taliban infiltrated Bangladesh?
No, there is that danger. And you know, the wonders of YouTube, I went back and I looked at one of the speeches given by the father of Bangladesh, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and the speech he gave in 1971. It was electrified the Bengali people at the time when he was calling for the liberation of Bangladesh, what was then East Pakistan. And he declared that I want to give the people of Bangla, which he called it at the time, political freedom. I want to give you economic freedom and cultural freedom. Well, what we're seeing now is, you know, that dream dying before our very eyes with these attacks. I mean, not only have these attacks been as disturbing as my colleagues noted, there's an actual hit list of 84 individuals who have been targeted by various groups. Now we don't know who these groups are. And to your question, is we seeing a Pakistan-like situation? I think we're very much seeing a Pakistan-like situation in which there's a radical jihadist soup that is growing and is metastasizing, and it is getting away with these kind of attacks, and security services are proving themselves unable to stop them. And it is a direct threat to the civil society that Simon spoke of, because Bangladesh does have a robust civil society, as does Pakistan, a tradition of free media, a tradition of secularism, as you noted, you know, NGOs that are operating quite, you know, openly, and this is you know, we're witnessing a fight for the soul of Bangladesh.
And Simon, as you pointed out, well, as we've often heard, you know, to solve a problem, one has to acknowledge that there is a problem in the first place. And the government has to do that.
Absolutely right. I mean, that's the heart of the issue here, right? I mean, you have a government that is not acknowledging the problem, that is actually, in the case of the attacks this week, almost blaming those people who were killed by saying they published pornography on the internet, they were clearly trying to bring society into disrepute. I mean, that's a shameful response to what's taken place, and it's also not dealing with the situation with any degree of straightforwardness or honesty.
Okay, Simon, I'm going to stay with you. Britain will vote on whether to leave the European Union, that national referendum taking place on June 23rd. President Barack Obama got involved in that fracas as well. He raised a bit of a stir when he voiced support for for Britain staying in Europe. Now, critics of the president said that he's interfering in a domestic matter right here. Is that fair criticism, or, I mean, is Britain's place in the EU an international affair?
I'm not sure it's criticism. I think it's a statement of fact. Yeah. He is interfering in the affairs of the UK, and indeed he acknowledges that that's what he's doing. He was challenged about this while he was in London, and he said, look, I think that on an issue of this magnitude, the British people deserve to know what I truly think, because previously, we all knew that Barack Obama thought the United Kingdom should stay in the EU, but he'd never actually directly articulated it. So this was a very dramatic moment in Britain, and it's hard to know exactly how it's going to play out, because if you look at polling just over the last few days, the majority of voters questioned say that of all the people that they've heard opining over whether Britain should stay in the EU or not, the one that carries the most weight is Barack Obama. His name's right there at the top of the list. However, it's not immediately clear that they're all listening to him, because this was the week where the No campaign, the people who want to pull Britain out of the EU, took a very narrow lead in the opinion polls against David Cameron and the others who want to keep Britain in. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out before one can draw a conclusion as to whether Barack Obama helped or hindered the case for keeping Britain in.
But to the other point, I mean, Britain's place in the EU, is that an international issue?
Oh, it's an absolutely massive international issue, which I think that Barack Obama was overstating. I mean, the idea that, you know, should Britain leave the EU, Britain's going to go to the back of the line in terms of negotiating trade deals with the United States. No one in Britain, I think, believes that, and nobody in America believes that. But for a Britain to leave the European Union, for the degree of disruption that that would create, the degree of uncertainty and instability it would create, you know, nothing stays at home within a country's borders anymore, and that of course is part of the reason why David Cameron and others consistently argue that's why we've got to be part of this bigger thing, even if at times it drives us crazy.
Guan, the Chinese President Xi Jinping, he said that he wants the United Kingdom to stay in Europe. How big an economic or trade issue is this for China?
Well, you know, when President Xi visited the UK not so long ago, both him and Prime Minister Cameron caught this relationship, experiencing the golden era of the relations, and China thinks the UK is its best partner, best friend in the West. I think China has a stake not just economically, but in terms of security as well. Let's not forget the EU's arms embargo on China due to its 1989 political incident is still in place, and China has repeatedly called for the lifting of the sanctions of arms embargo. Beijing pretty much hopes the UK can stay part of the EU, so that when it comes to not just trade embargoes, but also to a lifting of the arms embargoes, the UK can play a role, can voice its support for China.
Actually, in getting to Simon's point, you know, with the no vote gaining a few points after Barack Obama made those comments, what are the driving forces, or what's driving the forces that want Britain to leave the EU?
You know, I think what we're seeing is you know, and it's happening in Britain, but it's happening here in the United States as well, and in parts of Europe as well. There is a gathering momentum that believes that globalization, free trade, these kind of things hurt middle classes, right? And I think this is a dangerous gathering momentum, because I think the history of post-World War II growth has been you build an infrastructure, you create an environment conducive to business, and you trade with the world. and you integrate with the world. Now, there are always going to be losers in globalization and losers in free trade. And I think what we're seeing is, that driving, Britain's move towards, potential, as they say, Brexit. But I think that I wouldn't count out the Remain camp. I think, when push comes to shove, the arguments that have been made by the UK Treasury, the arguments that have been made by President Obama, the arguments that are being made daily, every single night on the British television, as you know, the economic numbers show that Britain will be better off if they remain.
They do, but there's a danger still that at the end of the day, you walk into that polling place and it's an emotional decision. Right. And it's an emotional decision that can be driven by recent events. More migration, another terrorist attack. You're not going to know until those votes are counted exactly how it's gone down.
Right. But Simon, is there a feeling in Britain, among a significant part of the population, that globalization is fine, as Afshin has just pointed out, but it's benefited just a few at the top, not us, so we need to get out of this?
Absolutely, without question. The narrow 1% in Britain is as vibrant and emotional a political issue as it is here in the United States or in other parts of the world. And there is also this abiding sense that somehow, by being involved in this grand European experiment, this has all just become an affront to British sovereignty. Even though many times you can dismiss that, you can actually provably show that it hasn't been, that Britain's sovereignty is as protected and safe today as it was back in the 1970s when this conversation first began. Despite that fact, emotionally, there is this sense that the Remain campaign has to get across that Britain's sovereignty is somehow safe within this broader transnational framework.
Okay, let's get to the next big story. Afshin.
Yes, I think the next big story is watch U.S. growth. We're living in a world of lower for longer. So we saw the first quarter growth numbers that have come out for 2016 showed that U.S. had grown its slowest pace in 2 years. The IMF recently cut global growth forecasts for the 4th time this year. So this lower for longer is going to contribute to all of these things we just discussed. The anti-globalization movement, the rise of populists on the right and the rise of populists on the left. And it's going to put a lot of pressure in elections throughout Europe and here in the United States, which we've already seen.
Okay, let's come down the line. Simon.
Venezuela. That's what I think is the next big story. This was the week when if you were a government worker in Venezuela, you were told you are now working a 2-day week to preserve electricity and resource supplies in a country that, by the way, is not particularly resource challenged in terms of its natural resources. How much longer the Venezuelan government can hold things together while the situation on the ground gets worse and worse, fewer and fewer goods in the stores, prices going through the roof constantly, now government workers working a 2-day week. At some point, that no longer holds. The center can't hold, and I think Venezuela is a place to keep a very close eye on.
And there's going to be some serious political implications, aren't there?
Yes, absolutely, and implications for the United States as well, which of course has a tortuous relationship with the Venezuelan government, had a tortuous relationship with Hugo Chavez, slightly improved relationship with Maduro, but still very tense. So yes, without doubt.
Guan, what's the next big story?
I think South China Sea, in that the International Court of Arbitration will hand it down its decision, its ruling on the Philippines' lawsuit against China in South China Sea, primarily against its 9-line claims. So we will see which part prevails in the international ruling and how China will respond, and whether the issue of sovereignty can be decided by international arbitration, or is it falls into the domain of customary international law where bilateral negotiations is the way to go.
Remind us again, what is that lawsuit about?
The Philippines challenged China's claims of South China Sea, where China claims predominantly a large part of the ocean as well as the islands in it. And then there will be a ruling by the International Court of Arbitration. So we can expect the ruling in May or perhaps June. And there will be some heated discussion. The U.S., how the U.S. respond, how Beijing responds, and how the Philippines respond will all matter.